Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Douglas Dialogues conversation with everybody today. And we have very special guests today, three of them. One is Professor Jack Kaufman-McKivigan from University-Indianapolis, and then Professor Danjuma Gibson from the Calvin Theological Seminary, and Heather L. Kaufman from the Institute of American Thought at University-Indianapolis as well. And the topic of this is really exciting, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation between these three wonderful guests is going to be psychoanalyzing Frederick Douglass. Now, that's really exciting, and I can't wait to hear more and hear about the research from everyone. And I want to just thank Jack and Danjuma and Heather for joining us for this conversation during Douglass Week 2024. Jack has joined us many times before, so we're really grateful for his continued support and contribution to Douglass Week. And we look forward to this. And I'd like to hand over to Jack now to introduce everyone and to start the conversation. So everyone enjoy. A warm welcome to all of you. And Jack, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Carolyn. Hi, I'm Jack Kaufman-McKivigan. I am the editor of the Frederick Douglass Papers. This is a federally financed research project that locates, collects, edits, and publishes the works of Frederick Douglass. So far, we've actually gotten 13 out of 15 volumes of our intended series in print. Because we're coming to the end of that work, we have actually launched a digital Frederick Douglass project, which will now allow us to issue a comprehensive edition of all of Douglass's speeches, letters, and published writings. That's more than 10,000 documents that will be online, not tomorrow, but in about 5 or 6 years. I think we'll have that work done. Now, my guests today are, first of all, let me introduce Heather Kaufman first. Heather is a longtime researcher and research assistant here at the Frederick Douglass Papers, and a co-editor with me of three, besides the Douglass paper volumes, 3 additional paperback volumes dealing with different aspects of Douglass's life. But in recent years, Heather has taken her career in a new direction. She has become a trained mental health therapist and sees clients here in Indianapolis. While she is still pursuing research on Douglass, she's also publishing scholarship on religious experience as related to psychotherapy. Now, I invited Heather to be part of this panel because I think we will benefit from her expertise when the two of us interview this panel's main guest, Dr. Danjuma Gibson, a professor of pastoral theology, care, and counseling at Calvin Theological Seminary. He's also in private practice as a psychotherapist in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dr. Gibson also is the author of a fascinating recent book from Palgrave Macmillan entitled Frederick Douglass, a Psychobiography, Rethinking Subjectivity in the Western Experiment of Democracy. That was 2018. Even more recently, Dr. Gibson has published a new volume, Through the Eye of Titans, the self-care practices of personalities like Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Benjamin Mays, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., all definitely titans in the campaign for racial justice here in the United States. I've been reading this latest book from Dr. Gibson this week and was pleased to see a considerable amount of attention given in it to Frederick Douglass, who certainly was a pathbreaker for later generations of activists. So let's get to our conversation.
I'd just like to show the 2 books that Jack was just talking about. It's a psychobiography of Frederick Douglass, and then Danjuma Gibson's latest book, Through the Eyes of Titans. And so I just wanted to say welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. Gibson. We're really grateful that you were able to join us today.
Thank you so much, Jack and Heather, for having me. This is exciting.
And so this is where I would like to start, considering your body of work as it is now. As a pastoral counselor and psychotherapist, why do you think people in the 21st century should know more about Douglass?
You know, Heather, I think that is an excellent question and very timely, given the season we're in this country where we're seeing a lot of books banned by Black and brown scholars, Black and brown authors. Frederick Douglass embodies what it means to be an American. And sometimes I think we forget that really there's only one thing that makes all of us Americans, and that's the Constitution. It's not any family lineage or any type of heritage. It's the Constitution and adhering to those values that underwrote it, values about liberty, freedom. These are the values that underwrote the Constitution, and we see this in Douglass. And so Douglass is just not an important figure for Black and Brown people. Douglass belongs really to all of America, all of humanity. And so just as someone would think it is important for their children or themselves to learn about people like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, I mean, the founding fathers, the list goes on. It's just as important for them to know about Frederick Douglass and what he did to really protect the democratic experiment. He recognized that the slavocracy and slavery was an affront to everything that America stood for. And I believe that he demonstrates a moral genius that far exceeds that of the founding fathers and the architects of the Constitution. And so as a therapist, as a pastoral counselor, theologian, I think knowledge of the body of work of Frederick Douglass today is very much needed, and it's indispensable.
Wow. Fascinating. And we second all those sentiments for sure about the value of Douglass and his thinking. He's an underappreciated figure in American history that has to be brought to the forefront with as you're saying, maybe even in front of some of those founding fathers. Now, let's be candid. There's probably some people listening who are a little bit skeptical about the idea of psychobiography. All right, especially when you didn't meet Frederick Douglass, you didn't have Frederick Douglass come to your office over a prolonged period of time for intensive therapy. But I got to say that Heather and I, who've read your book, we're completely convinced that the insights that you've presented on Douglass are just fascinating and add to the knowledge of what motivated him to undertake this long career of activism.
And so to that question, Dr. Gibson, thinking of some of the basic concepts of classic psychoanalytic theory that you take up in your work. How do you think that account for some of the extreme experiences that slave encounters? For example, how well do you feel contemporary psychoanalytic theory accounts for the kind of cultural trauma that Douglass witnessed and endured?
And so, I mean, there are a couple of things to this. Speaking to what both of you have presented, I think, so I would disagree, Jack, number one, for those who sort of downplay the value of psychobiography and psychohistory. I've heard some of those criticisms, how people will minimize the body of work. And I'm not, some of it, I think, as you have with any discourse, some of it reflects fundamentalism. I mean, theorists believe that, after whether their theorist is Freud or whomever, that time sort of stops with that person, and then there's nothing else after that. Psychobiography and psychohistory gives us the why, or has the potential to give us the why of history. Why did this happen? Why did this occur? It has the potential to really deconstruct our potential to romanticize history. Sometimes I share with my students, while technology may advance, human animus does not advance. We're still making humans the same way today as they were made 2,000 years ago. And so psychohistory and psychobiography, I believe, are indispensable to really how, what we can get out of, the body of history. And then Heather, when you talk about, if I understand your question correctly, how do I feel some of the concepts of classical theory, how does it account for some of the extreme experiences Douglas encountered? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Well, it's mixed. I think in some areas, contemporary, what we know about trauma has a lot of explanatory power, but in other cases, I don't think it does it very well. And here's where I'll get at that in a couple of places. First, the slavocracy predates Freud and his contemporaries. It predates it. And so what I attempted to do in my project, the Frederick Douglass text, instead of reading Douglass's life through the lens of contemporary psychoanalytic theory, I took Douglass's life and tried to read contemporary psychoanalytic theory through the lens of Douglass. And in many instances, it failed. Not in all instances, and it was not my intent for it to fail, but it failed. And it failed really in two main areas. A lot of contemporary theory begins with the family of origin. It begins with the assumption that there is somehow a safe space where human subjectivity has the potential to be cultivated by caregivers, or, they use the word good enough. So you don't have to be the perfect mother or father, but good enough parenting, good enough fathering, good enough mothering. I think often one of the most overlooked atrocities of the slavocracy was the breakup of Black and brown families. And I mean, just imagine that for a minute. Imagine what someone had to contemplate. I mean, I think we know more, or people are more accustomed of the history when they'll see photos or historical literature about families being broken up as they were sold. And obviously that is traumatic, not knowing where, if you would ever see your family member again. But think about the person who has to contemplate freedom and who they will leave behind. And so you're having to make a choice of freedom if you decide to run, and having to do the calculus of who you will leave behind. That is devastating. And so what the slavocracy does to families, it really has the risk or the potential to turn contemporary psychoanalytic theory on its head if we assume that contemporary psychoanalytic theory is representative of all humanity, or that it is somehow, it can somehow be essentialized or globalized. And so that's one area where I believe it falls short in its explanatory power of the slavocracy. But also in another area, I think it falls short, and that's the context of extremity. Douglass existed in an extreme context that trauma really cannot get at our understanding of a contemporary trauma, because trauma talks about a baseline, an emotional baseline. Then there's a trauma-causing event, a catastrophic event that constitutes a new level, a new baseline. And so we can understand that, and that can be somewhat of a permanent baseline based on, whatever the atrocity was. We see that with veterans. We can see that with victims of crime. We've learned so much about that, unfortunately, with childhood sexual abuse. But in the slavocracy, someone was born into this extremity, and it was normalized for a certain group of people. I'm not saying it was normal, but it was done so effortlessly that it was normalized. And so even concepts like complex trauma, which tried to get at trauma from a developmental perspective. Children who were abused at a young age, and maybe they carried that on. Even complex trauma doesn't get at what I believe we see in the slavocracy. And so it's really, it's a mixed bag. I think there are some areas where there's explanatory power, but there are other areas that I think are really exciting, if people have the humility to say, you know what, there's a lot more we can learn. For example, and I'll let you move on. I think we've seen a lot of innovative work in cultural trauma or collective trauma after the Holocaust. People writing about successive generations and how they have been impacted by the Holocaust. We've seen a lot of good work around the psychology of how could this happen with the perpetrators, how primary defenses and secondary defenses and compartmentalization. Heather, I'm sure you've read a lot of that. So I think we've seen some good work, but I think it's a mixed bag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're really speaking to, it doesn't get to the heart of what Douglas's experience was,
Sure.
and how he developed the capacity, for resistance in the face of such extremity. And so, that kind of, it left me wondering, how do you think that Douglas was able to navigate and really become a liberated man, a self-actualized man, really, in the context of the slavocracy, where the normalization of development didn't exist?
Sure. Well, there's a lot there. So I think the way I'll approach this is starting with how the area of resilience literature sort of frightens me when we talk about anyone who's been victimized, whether that's Douglas, his contemporaries, or any other victim of human atrocity. Because it has the tendency, when we talk about resilience literature, a lot of what we come across, if we're not careful, you run the risk of saying, hey, look at this person. They survived. And if the rest of you just did what they did, then you would be fine. And that totally overlooks the perpetrators. And this is why I'm sure you guys are familiar with her work, Judith Herman, and her work on trauma. The reason I think Judith Herman's work on trauma still stands apart today, in my opinion, because of how she includes environment and the community. And she's basically saying you cannot talk about psychological trauma without talking about human evil. And so while, yes, we can talk about some things Douglas had in terms of resilience, I think you see in all of his autobiographies, there's a reference where I think in several places he says, or he imagines things would have been different had he been further south.
Yes.
And so I have to say, and this may not sound like a scholarly answer, but Douglas had a lot of luck. Yes. And for me, that's very important to point out. He had a lot of luck in what he encountered. He was lucky, for instance, when he had to fight with Covey, and Covey did not report that to the authorities. He assumed it was out of his own personal embarrassment. But I think also, in addition to that, how do we understand Douglas and him becoming who he was? We have to give some credence to the first 4 or 5 years he spent with his grandmother, and what she perhaps instilled in him. Now, that corroborates, in my opinion, object relations. Of the importance, and I wholeheartedly believe this, probably, from a developmental perspective, the most valuable years of any of us are those formative years, the first 5, 6 years, trying to do something by the time someone is a teenager. I mean, anything helps, but there could be a lot of unhealthy ideas that have taken root that can be very difficult to extricate. And so I think the time that he spent with his grandmother, and then, there are those issues behind what I talk about in my book, which center on this idea of the force of being. And I don't know if, we'll go into that later, but right now I'm just sort of answering this question from the periphery of, of how, of Douglas's experience. I think also relationships like the one he had with Sandy, who gave him this root. It was a short-lived relationship, but nonetheless, it was a life-changing relationship. And it was never clear to me in the writings if Douglas really understood what the root Sandy gave to him, what that did for him.
Yeah.
I'm not clear Douglas understood that, besides just rehearsing the story. And for those who are watching, Sandy was someone Douglas met in a very short period of time, who basically sort of encouraged him, saying, if you take this route, no one else will be able to beat you here, because Douglas feared for his life because he ran away from where he was supposed to be. And so when I look at that, even the value of short, brief, but impactful relationships. It's not necessarily the length of time of a relationship that defines it or can define a mentor, but it's the intensity of the impact. It's someone saying, I believe in you. It is someone saying, I believe in you. Someone corroborating your humanity and your potential. That is very powerful. And I don't know where we find that in contemporary human development theory.
Yeah. And now Sandy, some historians interpret Sandy as kind of a hoodoo preacher. And it's kind of a, bringing in a Christian religious ideas in there. And you're right. I remember Douglas kind of being, I don't know whether I believed him or not, but I'm taking that rock with me when I go to see Covey. I'm not taking any chances. If it works, I'm all in favor of it. It's just great. But you're saying about these Douglas being lucky, and I know Heather's thought about this too. That luck he also kind of credits to a higher power in some ways, right?
Say more. I mean, are you talking about how he understands it? Are you talking metaphysical? I mean, how are you talking here?
Well, yeah, I'm probably stealing from Heather, but I think it was metaphysical, that he thought that there was some divine intervention working on his side that gave him that strength to get through these crises that he faced as an enslaved person.
Well, Douglas certainly uses the word providence on several occasions. And I think in my text, I talk about how his context influences his God talk. And that faith and God talk is dynamic. When we are doing well, our God talk takes on a pompous, egocentric tone. And when we are not doing well, our God talk can take on a kind of a negative tone of despair.
Yes.
And so I certainly, in how he talks about providence and God's plan for him when he's on the plantation, and how he talks about this idea of deliverance. It sounded to me like a lot of places I can hear today, depending on, what church you go to or what faith tradition you go to, where people talk in terms of deliverance or how God has a plan for them or how God is using them. But then after Douglas secures his freedom, he takes on a different tone. And this is not to say that he does not have faith, but he seems to be more critical of people who talk the way he used to talk. It makes me wonder if he forgot how he used to talk about God's plan and wanting churches and clergy to be more active in whatever it was that he was involved in, whether that was before the war or after the war. And so his faith was more about productivity. But I argue that also comes from, he was in a more conducive environment of freedom that allowed him to think that way and develop that sort of God talk, where when you're in the slavocracy, what else can you talk about but God's providence and God's plan?
Yes. Since you're under that control of that enslaver so much, yeah. You're interesting. I had you were talking about teaching and students. And this semester, I had my students read an excerpt from a biography of James Henry Hammond, who's a South Carolina slaveholder. It's by books by Drew Gilpin Foss. And she felt that Hammond, he wasn't a trained psychologist at all, but he tried to use what sense of psychology to convince his slaves that they were totally dependent upon him. And Douglas, when he encounters people like Covey, was kind of put into a comparable situation. So how did Douglas kind of resist that brainwashing that some enslavers tried to impose upon their victims?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, it's complex. I don't think Douglas started out being this sort of model superhero that could resist this sort of brainwashing, or as he used, I love the word he used, priestcraft, this sort of play on religion and witchcraft. He calls it priestcraft. And so I want to talk about this from two perspectives. From those who Douglas was saying he would lose patience with when they bought into it, and his development of it. Let's start with those who Douglas says were brainwashed. And I agree, at the end, they were brainwashed. But which one of us would not be brainwashed if we were in those conditions?
Yeah.
I am, and Heather, you may be familiar with this. There's in Fairbairn's object relations text from, I think it's the early 50s. There's this famous line that's still used today that he has in there about when children internalize them bad objects, or when children see themselves as bad. And he says that it's better to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to live in a world ruled by the devil.
Yeah.
And
exactly. Yeah.
I think has tremendous explanatory power for what we are seeing. Douglas, again, I concede that is brainwashing to believe that your bondage is divinely oriented, or that somehow using psychology get people to buy into it. However, a lot of times the stories that we use is a matter of meaning making to get us through something. And with those that Douglas refers to, those enslaved individuals, as being brainwashed, imagine someone, if you take what Fairbairn says, imagine someone who has to resign themselves to, I'm going to die in this situation. Do I want to die in this? Is it better to die in this situation believing that God is somehow involved, or to die in this situation under another paradigm that God is not as powerful as I think he is, and evil is more powerful, or God is not concerned about me at all? So in some ways, I wonder if this brainwashing that Douglas is witnessing, is it a form of psychological coping?
Oh, very good. Yes.
Yeah, you're really speaking to like a defense against like psychic fragmenting, right? Like the fragmentary nature.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We see it today. Someone in a domestic violence relationship defending the abuser. Now, it's not healthy. The end result is not healthy. And so what are the mechanisms? There's so much work to be done, I think, just historically in this area. What are the compensatory mechanisms? What are the coping mechanisms that people use for posterity's sake? I have to stay alive as long as I can for those who are coming after me.
No.
My respect and regard for those who could not escape and run the way Douglas did, my regard for them is high. What they had to do so that others could possibly have a chance. Now let's talk about Douglas and your question, how did he escape that? I think some of it has to do with this force of being, that at our core, we are simply not meant, we're not meant for enslavement. Douglas talks about this, and I forget which one it is, but he talks about this. He says, by nature, the sermons that were coming across at St. Michael's, he says, by nature, we just didn't believe it. Because there were some who just believed that, or who knew that this was a lie, whether they were using psychological resources or religious resources. And so there was something that perhaps then we are born, and that's what the argument I'm making when I talk about this force of being in my book, that there's something about that. But then that it begs the question then, and I don't know, how is the force of being stronger in some than in others? You know, I don't know that answer. But then secondly, when Douglas decides to go back to the plantation after he ran from Covey, he goes back. I think there was something happening already when he presented his bloodied self to I think it was Master Thomas.
Yes, Tom Sullivan.
And what did he say? He basically had no empathy, no sympathy for him. He just looked at him like, so what? That I don't believe this really happened.
Yeah.
Douglas says when he walked away from that interaction, he says the spell of priestcraft was broken. So there's something, I call it body talk. There's intellect is not only in our cognition, but when we listen to our bodies. And there was something, there was an intellect that was coming from his body that was basically telling him, all of this is wrong. Anything that's contributing to your condition is wrong. And he says it was broken. And that really prepped him for that fight with Covey.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to like a really kind of embodied kind of inner knowing that
Absolutely.
we came into being through relationship. And part of that, how do we come to know ourselves, is through our body, that it's embodied experience.
There was, and I won't go into this too much because it slightly changes the subject, but to your point, over the last year, I was working on a research project with two other colleagues, one from Baylor University and one from Niagara University, and we were looking at how Black and Brown communities engage in lament in the aftermath of racial violence, racial massacres, these mass shootings that we've seen. But one of the things we wanted to look at is how the impact this would have on students. What is it like if we're just teaching this in a classroom versus if students travel and their body is now on location? Their body is on location in the area. I think there's a different type of pedagogy. There was something about the pedagogy of violence that Douglass experienced from Covey and the pedagogy of apathy that he experienced from Thomas Auld that ultimately, he says with finality, it broke the hold of priestcraft. And his language was stronger there than any time before when he talked about priestcraft.
Wow. Yeah, I remember how at the end of the narrative when he goes over to England, he adds a section just directly assessing the hypocrisy of the slaveholders' religion. It's very powerful. He's kind of reclaiming Christianity from what the slaveholders had tried to preach to him back in Maryland. Why don't we talk a little bit about those autobiographies? Because you make a big point. Douglass, after he's become free, it goes back and reflects upon his life in a series of autobiographies. Douglass is a serial autobiographer. All right, and you describe this as a counter hegemonic strategy. Could you explain that?
Sure. Why does a man have to write 4 autobiographies? I know most people say 3, so I mean, whichever number you want to use. Why? Is it that he can't figure it out? No, I think this is where our understanding of narrative psychology really comes into play, and Douglass, he really offers a fine example of this. But I think this is also this is the business, right, Heather, that you and I are engaged in psychotherapy, where we are talk therapists, some people refer to it as, and people are telling the same story, although it's not the same story, but generally the same story over and over and over again with nuance until they don't have to tell it anymore. And that in many ways is that corrective emotional experience that leads to healing. I believe the writing of these autobiographies was Douglass's corrective emotional experience that resisted the depravity and the oppression of the slaveocracy. The actual process of writing and then having written, the joy of having written about himself was accretive to his subjectivity. So when we think about narrative psychology, and we're really talking about human subjectivity that is accrued through how we understand ourselves, and how we understand ourselves by the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And more often than not, that's happening unconsciously. We're always telling ourselves a story about ourselves. There's a private version, and then there's a public version. And these are reciprocal, but over time, they lead towards us building up a healthy sense of self or a fragmented sense of self based on the narratives that we are telling ourselves and the space where there is an empathic hearer or listener. And this is what I mean, Douglass's life is like so many of our lives, where it begins in despair. Then you have this peak. And at this peak, you think everything, you figured life out. Douglass believes that progress is linear and permanent. And then life happens. And so his pre-existing meaning-making tools have expired. And so in this last autobiography, he has to do some reinventive work, some rethinking on how am I thinking about this? And so we see this throughout his life cycle, which makes his life so rich, which makes it fertile ground for psychobiography and psychohistory. But he gives us an example of the importance of narrating our own story. And the stories that we internalize and the stories that we should not internalize.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, thinking about, in working with our clients and the stories they tell themselves, the stories that have been told to them about them, and how in a very parallel way, it's about not only an empathetic listener, but also a creative kind of exchange and understanding in which someone is allowed to play with the details of their life in a way that promotes healing and to make order where once there was turbulence, fragmentation. And that kind of brings me to, my next questions regarding Douglas's like internal resources, how, he was able to resist oppression in the way that he was when facing such inhumane conditions. I think we've touched on that previously, but I think it's also about what we're saying now is it's about making meaning of his life experiences at different junctures. And I'm wondering how you see that being interwoven with his understanding of his own life's work as he's looking back at it, right? With these 4 autobiographies having been written.
So there are a couple of things there we can talk about. And I think this really gets at this idea of the force of being that I'm describing. One I call, and again, I think Douglas sort of just, he haphazardly, he comes across these things. I don't think these are things he pre-planned, but it's this idea of sacred space of play, or spaces where we can imagine the unimaginable. And as you both are familiar with the text, he really comes to the decision that he's not going to remain on the plantation. He's going to take the risk and run, not from discourse from anyone, not from reading a book, but by watching boats as he's on the shore of it's the Chesapeake Bay, I believe.
Yes.
And I had an opportunity. I was at a convention a few years back, and I had an opportunity to drive up to that area. I wanted to see what I would feel, and I didn't feel anything. But just to be on the shore there of the Chesapeake Bay was very, very intimidating. I mean, the water is intimidating. Now, I can't swim, so maybe that had something to do with it. But that he could imagine freedom by watching the sails of the boat. And so what we talked about, the importance of writing narratives as a counter-hegemonic strategy. A second area I would then say is just the importance and the value of imagination. There is never a wrong time or a wrong or a wrong place to imagine. And when evil, when oppression overtakes your imagination, where you give up on imagining, I think we're done.
Yeah.
Imagination is powerful. And so he talks about, he talks about these, sometimes when he's walking between particular areas, I guess on the plantation, that he has time to imagine and to think. He loses himself. And in many ways, this reminds me of how D.W. Winnicott talks about this idea of play. and how, if you want to think about psychopathology, it's really adults that have the problem, because children know how to use their imagination, the value of it, and to play, and they never ask the question, is this real or not? Because that's irrelevant when it comes to imagination. We socialize our children out of this vital capacity. We socialize them through concepts like grow up. What do you want to do when you get out of college? What do you want to major in? And so we train our children to be producers and task-oriented. I think we're seeing this in schools across the nation that are giving up on liberal arts programs, giving up on the humanities, and they are focusing on science and math. And the idea is, well, we need to train our students to get a job. What happened to education that trains us to be human beings and thinkers and imaginers? And so that's, now I imagine in the violence of the slavocracy, he didn't think about imagination being so vital. This is hindsight, but it's clear to have that space to imagine a future where a future that was unimaginable in the slavocracy was very key for him. And then, this final, we sort of touched on it, this final area of how he was able to overcome is, what I refer to as bodily agency and the importance of listening to our bodies. And even after this fight with Covey, it's just so profound. He says, while I remained a slave in fact, I was no longer a slave in form.
Very good. Very good.
And how relevant is that today for millions of people who may not be able to change their circumstances and have to learn to live with their backs against the wall, as Howard Thurman talks about in his seminal text, Jesus and the Disinherited.
I'm a little concerned. Heather and I have so many more questions we want to ask you. We talk the rest of the afternoon, but I know our listeners have other things to be doing. Let me shift the focus a little bit from your psychobiography of Douglass into this latest book that you wrote, Through the Eyes of Titans, because it does give a considerable amount of attention to Frederick Douglass as a precursor of the major figures you're going to look at. And you've already alluded to, Douglass in his later years having to deal with issues that he hadn't suspected. He lived to see the day of Jubilee in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And then he lived another 20 years when things weren't going in the direction that he would have wished for, or maybe even anticipated. And you noted in your book that Douglass was struggling with what you call the romanticization of history, that people are trying to forget the uncomfortable portions of the past and believe that the future will inevitably improve. Sadly, today our romanticization is gone, right? What kind of lessons can we learn for how Douglass dealt with a period of kind of disappointing history?
Wow, you saved that question for this time. That's a big question.
Sorry.
At the risk of making it sound all too easy, because it wasn't easy for him, but he remained steadfast in the idea of truth telling. Of recounting, of understanding, okay, there's a story that we would like to hear, but what is the reality of what we are hearing? And while he died before this emerging lost cause narrative began to come out in the early 20th century, I think he foresaw where this was going.
Yes, absolutely.
He could see it going that way in how people were telling the story of the slaveocracy and the Civil War. And so I think Douglass, you know, and I'm forgetting his name now. James Baldwin.
Yeah.
He says in this, I don't know if you've seen this documentary, I Am Not Your Negro.
Yes, I
But
have.
he
Wonderful.
talks about the idea of how America loves simplicity, basically people not thinking and being mindless, and how that leads to us celebrating immaturity. And in many ways, I think Douglass, no matter how heartbroken he was as he saw things on the decline, and we see that in Lessons for the Hour.
Yeah.
He refused to give into the temptation of simplicity just to make himself feel better or for an emotional experience. And I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. Even when the statue of Lincoln is erected in Washington, D.C., and Lincoln has his hand on this enslaved individual, you would think that Douglass is coming there to celebrate everything good about Lincoln, but I think he's doing something more than just being tough. And I hear people, even contemporary historians, talk about it in that way. I think he's resisting this. It's a coping mechanism that all of us have to gloss over human atrocity when our illusions of safety and security are being violated.
Yeah. Heather, do you have a final question? I know we're concerned about time.
Yeah, I did, because, in thinking about like what you're saying, Jack, about the kind of era we're living through now where, we're seeing a lot of progress being undone. I'm thinking like in the face of so many kind of intractable problems we're facing right now that feels so difficult to make any movement forward or any progress for, what kind of inner psychological strengths do you think that are found in Douglass that he relied upon to continue to have an optimistic outlook, to kind of continue to have hope for humanity moving forward, that we ourselves can use to think about our own futures now, in the 2020s, into a new century. He lived
Yeah.
at a very different time, but not such a different time.
Yeah, very good.
So I'll respond to that with this, I guess, a final thought. I was a few years back at a pastoral theology conference. I was listening to a lecture by Dr. Miguel de la Torre. He teaches social ethics at Iliff School of Theology. And he made a comment that I think shook a lot of people, but I understood. He was commenting on Martin Luther King's where Martin Luther King often said, the arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice.
Oh, very good.
And he said, that's where I disagree with Martin Luther King. And he says, I don't believe the arc of the universe gives a damn. if there's going to be justice, and along those lines, it's really going to be left to the capacities of human beings. So this inner capacity, and I think Douglas was able to do this. You see this in his lessons for the hour, where he is not trying to redeem sort of the losses he's incurred in terms of his broken dreams about what he wished the democratic experience would have been or should have been. Through, the self-work, I imagine, that he went through the writing of the autobiographies, through the re-narrating of his story, through his imagination, he was able to be very pragmatic, to be able to assess the situation and to be grounded in that assessment, as opposed to the need to be grounded in a good story or to be happy. Mm-hmm. I think William James talks about this a lot. I love the work of William James, and he talks about the sick soul versus the happy-minded person or religious person, and this need always to be happy, and the inability to tolerate the reality of human animus and human evil. I think at the end, this is where we see Douglas comes out in Lessons for the Hour, and he doesn't live long after that, but I think there's a lot we can learn from that. Mm-hmm. Truth-telling and doing that sort of work where we understand that this is not liberty and freedom and resisting structures of oppression. That's just not something that's going to fall out of the sky. Each of us have an active role and responsibility.
Wow, that's an encouraging message. And thanks for mentioning Lessons of the Hour. Maybe next year we'll all come back and talk about that speech by Douglas, because the three of us you see on the screen are all actually working collectively on a volume about Douglas's last great speech, which I think does speak to the day. Well, this has really been a fascinating hour of conversation. I hope our listeners agree that Douglas remains as much an inspiring figure in our times as he was in his own. In fact, I can't help but wish that we still had him around to help us remain optimistic that fundamental American and humanitarian principles can guide us through the mess we find ourselves in today. So again, thanks to our guest, Heather Kaufman, a Douglas researcher and mental health therapist here in Indianapolis, and especially to Dr. Danjuma Gibson of Calvin Theological Seminary. I hope everyone will get a hold of Danjuma's books and use them in their own self-care. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you from our side, from the Douglas Week team as well. Thank you, Professor Kaufman-McKivigan, Professor Gibson, and Heather Kaufman for this fascinating conversation. I want to thank you specifically for sharing your unique insights and your research, Professor Gibson. I feel like I really had an opportunity to get to know a new side of Douglas and his life and his experiences. And I've been studying Douglas for over 20 years at this point, and especially you outlining the complexities of trauma and enslavement, agency and identity. I think it's always really interesting to learn more about Douglas, obviously, but I have to say it was really fascinating to hear more about this psychoanalytic perspective and the approach to his life and the incredible man that he was. And I think, Jack, it was you who said earlier, maybe people are a little hesitant, after hearing the word psychobiography, what's that? But I'm pretty confident that we have convinced them here with this conversation. It's so fascinating, so interesting. I really want to thank you for this contribution to Douglas Week. I think it's very unique and really interesting. And I will make sure to include links to your research, all of your research and the work that you do. But specifically, want to give a shout out again to the wonderful books. And Heather, you held them up earlier. So make sure that you take a look and see if you want to maybe purchase one of Professor Gibson's books. One is Fred Douglass, A Psychobiography, Rethinking Subjectivity in the Western Experiment of Democracy. And the other one, Jack, you just talked about it there for the last part, Through the Eyes of Titan, Finding Courage to Redeem the Soul of a Nation. And on that note, really can't wait to hear more. Like you said, Jack, hopefully next year we'll be together again, maybe even in person. And I want to thank you again, Jack and Danjuma and Heather. Thank you everyone here for watching, for tuning in today, and for being here for Douglass Week. So happy Douglass Week, everyone, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.